El Salvador is the smallest nation in Central America, yet it carries the heartbeats of thousands of earthquakes, hundreds of eruptions, and countless uprisings. What kind of people choose to build their lives on land that shakes, burns, and bleeds? How do they survive when both nature and history seem determined to test them? In this video, we will journey through a land of volcanoes and storms, tracing the battles, tragedies, and triumphs that have forged its unbreakable spirit. Long before the first Spanish sails appeared on the Pacific horizon, long before the word El Salvador was ever spoken, this strip of land was already alive with the footfalls of civilizations that understood the language of the earth in ways modern maps cannot convey. And it was here, in a fertile yet treacherous basin framed by volcanoes and rivers, that the Pipil and the Lenca people carved out a life measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the cycles of the seasons, the path of the sun, and the tremors beneath their feet that spoke to them like the breath of gods. The people, speakers of a Nahuatl-derived tongue and likely migrants from central Mexico centuries before the Europeans arrived, brought with them agricultural systems that transformed valleys into emerald tapestries of maize, beans, and squash. Crops planted in intricate rotations that not only fed bodies, but bound communities together in rituals of planting, harvest, and gratitude. While the Lenca, whose origins stretched deep into the Honduran highlands, wove their own traditions into the land, practicing subsistence farming in the hills, exchanging goods in bustling markets, and guarding sacred sites where the boundaries between the living and the spirit world seemed thin enough to touch. In these ancient communities, religion was not a separate sphere of life, but the air they breathed. Every volcano was a divine being whose moods had to be read and respected. Every river had a spirit whose currents could bless or destroy. And the great cosmic order was maintained through ceremonies that mixed song, dance, and offerings of food, feathers, or incense. Priests, warriors, and farmers each carried their own role in keeping the balance. And war itself was not merely for conquest, but often a sacred duty, a means of proving courage, settling disputes, and gaining captives whose lives were woven into the ceremonial fabric of the society. Trade routes, snaking like veins across the land, connected these people to a broader Mesoamerican world. Salt from the coast traveled inland. Obsidian blades from the Guatemalan highlands gleamed in the hands of Pipil merchants, and the prized cacao beans, grown in the humid lowlands, were carried along forest paths to be exchanged for cotton textiles, ceramics, and tools. Such exchanges were more than transactions. They were threads in a vast web that tied El Salvador's pre-Columbian peoples to neighbors as far as the Yucatan and beyond. And yet, for all the richness of their cultures, they lived in the shadow of instability. For the same volcanic soil that made their fields bountiful was born of eruptions that could erase entire villages overnight, and the same rivers that nourished their crops could swell into destructive floods. Oral histories spoke of times when the sky turned black at noon, when ash fell like snow upon the milpas, and when communities were forced to abandon everything, moving to new ground with only what they could carry. Their gods traveling with them in carved idols and painted symbols. It was a world both intimate and immense, one in which a person might never travel more than a day's walk from their birthplace, yet still be connected through stories, rituals, and trade to civilizations hundreds of miles away. A world where identity was forged in the interplay between land and spirit, where survival depended on reading the signs of the earth as carefully as a farmer reads the clouds, and where power lay not in the number of soldiers one commanded, but in the favor of the deities who ruled the mountains, forests, and skies. In this delicate balance of abundance and danger, of cultural brilliance and environmental volatility, the people in Lenca built societies that would endure for centuries. their cities and fields thriving under the watchful eyes of volcanoes that gave and took in equal measure. And though they could not have known it, the skills, alliances, and beliefs they nurtured would soon be tested by a force unlike any they had faced before. A force that came not from the trembling earth or the shifting seas, but from across the ocean, carrying steel, disease, and a hunger for dominion. In the year 1524, when the highland winds still carried the scent of ripening maize and the markets of Cuscatlan bustled with the rhythmic exchange of cacao beans, textiles, and obsidian blades, the horizon of the Pacific bore witness to something neither the Pipil warriors nor the Lenca traders had ever seen before. Long, narrow ships with white, swollen sails that moved like ghosts across the water, each carrying men clad in glinting metal, bearing weapons that spat fire and thunder, and speaking in a tongue that rolled and cracked like stones tumbling down a mountainside. Led by Pedro de Alvarado, the lieutenant of Hernán Cortés, who had already drenched the soil of Mexico in blood and sought now to bring the same conquest southward. These newcomers came not only with swords and crossbows, but with a vision of the world in which their God was the only God, their king the only ruler, and their mission, framed in the language of faith, was to erase the sovereignty of every people they met and replace it with the rigid hierarchy of the Spanish crown. And yet the Pipil were not a people who would bow at the mere sight of steel, for they were seasoned in war, trained from youth in the art of combat, and deeply bound to their homeland, its rivers, forests, and volcanoes, as if by blood. The first encounters were less like negotiations and more like lightning strikes. Alvarado's forces moved inland from the coast, cutting through resistance with the calculated brutality honed in Mexico. But at the Battle of Acajutla, they met the defiance of warriors who fought with obsidian-tipped spears, bows that sang through the air, and a resolve born from knowing that every inch of ground lost was a thread cut from the tapestry of their ancestors. Yet even bravery cannot always hold against cavalry charges, steel blades, and the terror of gunpowder, which to the uninitiated was as much sorcery as weapon. What followed was not the swift surrender the Spaniards had expected, but a series of engagements marked by ambushes, retreats, and sudden counterattacks. As the Pipil adapted to their enemy's tactics and terrain became both shield and trap. Alvarado himself was wounded in the leg by an indigenous projectile, a wound that would plague him for the rest of his life. A testament to the ferocity of those early battles. Though in the Spanish chronicles, it was cast as a mark of his valor, rather than a reminder of the resistance he faced. Over time, however, the scales tilted. Not solely because of superior weaponry, but because of the devastating arrival of diseases carried unknowingly by the Spaniards. Sicknesses like smallpox that swept through the indigenous population with a speed and mortality beyond the reach of their healers, emptying villages before Spanish swords could even arrive, and breaking the chain of leadership as chieftains, warriors, and priests fell in staggering numbers. Alongside the epidemics came the calculated imposition of a new order. The destruction of idols and sacred places, the building of churches upon temple ruins, and the enforcement of baptism as both spiritual and political submission. The old gods were driven into the shadows, their names whispered in secrecy, while Spanish priests and administrators mapped the land not by its rivers and mountains, but by its potential for tribute and labor, carving it into encomiendas where surviving indigenous families would toil under the command of Spanish settlers. Yet even as this first wave of conquest tightened its grip, something of the old world endured. In the resilience of language, in the persistence of oral histories, in the quiet acts of defiance where rituals were hidden beneath the veneer of Catholic saints' days, and in the memory of battles like Acajutla, where the soil itself seemed to recall the courage of those who, for a brief, searing moment, stood against the tide of an empire that would not be stopped. With the conquest secured and the old centers of resistance subdued, the Spanish crown moved swiftly to transform the fertile valleys and volcanic slopes of El Salvador into an engine of wealth for a distant empire. And this transformation came not through the slow negotiation of cultures, but through the blunt machinery of the encomienda system, under which vast tracts of land, along with the labor of the surviving indigenous population, were granted to Spanish settlers and loyal soldiers, creating miniature kingdoms where the encomendero stood as both lord and judge, extracting tribute in the form of maize, cotton, cacao, and above all, the deep blue treasure of indigo dye, a commodity so prized in Europe that it was called blue gold, and would, for centuries, chain the fate of this small country to the whims of the global market. For the Pipil, the Lenca, and the few other indigenous groups who remained, this was not simply a change of ruler, but the imposition of a new and suffocating reality in which their traditional lands were parceled into estates they no longer controlled. Their workdays dictated by overseers whose language they did not speak, and their labor extracted under the watchful eye of the church, which preached salvation while enforcing obedience. The ceremonial calendar that had once revolved around planting and harvest was now punctuated by Catholic feast days, and the old gods were forced into the shadows, surviving only in whispered prayers or symbols disguised within Christian iconography. The indigo plantations, known locally as obrajes, became the beating heart of the colonial economy, and they were as much sites of suffering as they were of production. Here, men, women, and children labored from dawn until the fading of light, treading in vats of fermenting plants, their skin stained and their lungs filled with the acrid fumes of the dyeing process. While Spanish landowners grew rich enough to build tiled roof houses and sponsor gilded altars in San Salvador and Sonsonate, and the indigenous workers saw their bodies and time consumed for the wealth of others, their only respite, the thin thread of community that survived in the narrow spaces left by their overlords. In the cities, a rigid caste system crystallized, dividing society into peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe who claimed the highest offices and most lucrative posts, criollos, those of pure Spanish descent born in the Americas, who held local power but were barred from certain privileges, mestizos, the children of mixed heritage, who filled the ranks of artisans, soldiers, and small traders, and the vast mass of indigenous and African people, whose legal status, though not always codified as slavery, bound them to labor through debts, tribute, and coercion. In this hierarchy, mobility was possible only in rare cases, and always at the cost of assimilation into the Spanish world. Religion served as both balm and chain. The Franciscan and Dominican friars, alongside secular clergy, sought to convert the indigenous population through instruction and ritual, building churches on the ruins of temples, teaching prayers in Nahuatl and Lenca languages, and offering a narrative of suffering and redemption that sometimes echoed the people's own experience of loss. Yet this spiritual mission was inseparable from the political one, for to accept baptism was also to accept the authority of the crown, and to resist it was to be branded a heretic or rebel, subject to punishment that could range from public penance to the gallows. Over the decades, the rhythms of colonial life became entrenched. Indigo harvested in the countryside was carted to coastal ports, loaded onto ships bound for Spain, and sold for prices that dwarfed the wages of those who had labored to produce it. The profits returned to build more obrajes, import luxury goods for the elite, and fund the defense of the colony against pirates and rival empires. While the majority of Salvadorans, if that word could even be applied before the idea of a unified national identity existed, remained trapped in cycles of poverty and dependence. And yet, beneath the weight of this colonial order, seeds of change were sown. For the same trade networks that carried indigo and cacao to Europe also brought back news, ideas, and whispers of revolutions elsewhere. And the very system that bound El Salvador to Spain would, in time, create the tensions that would tear that bond apart, as the oppressed began to see, in the struggles of others, a mirror of their own longing for freedom. As the 17th century unfolded and the Spanish colonial order tightened its grip on the land, the demographic landscape of what would one day be called El Salvador was being reshaped in ways so profound that the memory of the original peoples, their villages, their languages, their gods, would, in many places, survive only in fragments. For the first and most relentless weapon of conquest had not been the sword or the musket, but the invisible tide of disease that the Spaniards had carried across the ocean. Pathogens like smallpox, measles, and influenza that spread faster than the march of armies, leaping from village to village with no regard for the lines of battle, and cutting down elders, warriors, midwives, and children alike until entire communities lay silent, their houses empty, their fields overgrown, and their stories interrupted mid-sentence. The mortality rates were staggering. Some estimates suggest that within the first century after contact, as much as 90% of the indigenous population of Central America perished, leaving behind not only a human void, but a cultural one. For with every life lost went a chain of memory, an inherited skill, a ritual gesture whose meaning could no longer be explained. And into this vacuum, the Spanish brought not only settlers from Europe, but also enslaved Africans, forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the holds of ships where chains rattled in the dark and where the journey itself claimed countless lives before the survivors were sold into the brutal labor of the haciendas and obrajes. In El Salvador, these African men and women were put to work alongside the remaining indigenous laborers, often in the same fields and workshops, bound by a shared condition of exploitation, even as colonial law and custom sought to divide them by origin, status, and perceived worth. The blending of their labor and suffering gave rise over generations to new cultural forms, musical rhythms, foodways, and beliefs that bore traces of multiple continents, even as the colonial elite tried to erase or suppress any element that did not conform to the imposed Spanish order. Forced migration was not limited to the transatlantic slave trade. For within the colony itself, indigenous communities were uprooted from ancestral lands and relocated to serve the economic needs of their encomenderos, moved closer to indigo works or cattle ranches, or concentrated into reducciones, planned settlements designed to facilitate both the collection of tribute and the process of religious conversion, where the church could oversee every aspect of life from baptism to burial, and where the original spatial relationship between people and their sacred landscapes was severed, breaking a connection that had been central to their identity. In the cities, the mingling of peoples, Spanish, African, indigenous, and mestizo, created a society of intricate hierarchies where skin color, birthplace, and parentage could determine one's fate, but also where cultural exchange happened in the spaces between oppression. Markets where African spices flavored maize-based dishes, where indigenous artisans carved Catholic saints with the faces of their own ancestors, where Spanish words took on new sounds in the mouths of Nahuatl speakers, and where, despite the constant pressure to assimilate, something stubborn and unyielding of the old world refused to vanish. Yet the cost of survival under these conditions was high. For every act of cultural preservation had to navigate the danger of punishment. And every moment of joy was tempered by the knowledge that the structures of power were designed to keep certain groups in perpetual subordination. The indigenous population, already devastated by disease and displacement, found itself locked into cycles of debt and dependency, while the descendants of enslaved Africans carried the dual burden of racial prejudice and economic exploitation, their labor feeding the wealth of a colonial system in which they had no stake. By the end of this long, slow catastrophe, the land itself bore the marks of these upheavals. Abandoned temple mounds overgrown with vegetation, fields that had once been communally tended now divided into estates, and villages where the faces of the people reflected a convergence of histories, both chosen and imposed. And though the original nations had been fractured beyond repair, their bloodlines and their stories, carried in whispered lullabies, in the cadence of a market cry, in the way hands shaped clay or wove cloth, would endure, waiting for the moment when history might again give them a voice. By the dawn of the 19th century, the seemingly immovable edifice of the Spanish Empire was beginning to crack, not because the colonies themselves had yet risen in coordinated rebellion, but because the very heart of imperial power in Europe was being shaken by events that would ripple outward across the Atlantic. As the Napoleonic Wars engulfed the Iberian Peninsula, French troops occupied Madrid, and King Ferdinand VII was deposed and imprisoned, leaving Spain's overseas possessions governed by a patchwork of colonial officials who could no longer rely on the unchallenged authority of a crown that was itself in chains. In El Salvador, as in much of Central America, this moment of imperial vulnerability did not immediately translate into open revolt. For the local Criollo elite, Spanish-descended but American-born, still benefited from the structures of privilege and feared that any upheaval might unleash social forces beyond their control, especially among the indigenous and mestizo majority who had borne the weight of centuries of exploitation. Yet the political instability in Spain created an opening for new ideas to take root. Ideas carried along the same trade and correspondence routes that had once transported indigo and cacao. Ideas about the sovereignty of peoples, about the rights of nations, and about the illegitimacy of rulers imposed from afar without consent. The example of the United States, which had broken away from Britain a generation earlier, and the dramatic rise of revolutionary France, with its declarations of liberty and equality, even if those ideals were unevenly applied, fed into a broader atmosphere of questioning. But it was the tremors from within Latin America itself that resonated most strongly. As the independence struggle in Haiti, the wars of liberation led by Simón Bolívar in the north, and the insurgency of Miguel Hidalgo and José María Morelos in Mexico, demonstrated that empires could, in fact, be challenged, and that colonial subjects could become citizens of new nations. News of these uprisings traveled slowly but steadily into the valleys and towns of El Salvador, sometimes through the formal channels of officials and clergy, more often through merchants, travelers, and clandestine pamphlets smuggled past censors. And with each retelling, the idea that the Spanish crown's authority was not divine or eternal gained ground, particularly among educated criollos and segments of the urban mestizo population, who began to envision a political order in which they, rather than distant bureaucrats, might govern the land and reap its wealth. At the same time, Spain's economic grip on its colonies was loosening under the strain of war. Shipping routes were disrupted by blockades, revenues from the Americas fell as trade faltered, and colonial administrators resorted to ever harsher methods of taxation and tribute collection to make up the shortfall, fueling resentment among both elites and commoners. The promise of imperial protection and stability, once the primary justification for colonial subordination, rang increasingly hollow when garrisons were underfunded, infrastructure decayed, and the distant metropole seemed incapable of defending itself. let alone its possessions. This was a dangerous moment for the colonial authorities in San Salvador. For while the majority of the population remained cautious, the memory of past indigenous resistance and the growing awareness of international revolutions combined to create an undercurrent of tension. An awareness that the world was shifting, that kings could fall, and that entire nations could be remade through the will of those who dared to fight for them. The colonial order still stood, but its foundations were hairline fractured, and the cracks were widening with each year of Spain's European humiliation. Thus, even before the first shots of El Salvador's own independence movement were fired, the psychological terrain had already shifted. The idea that Spain's rule was inevitable had been replaced, in certain circles, by the belief that it was merely temporary, and that the day would come when the volcanoes that had long watched over this land would see a flag raised not in the name of an empire across the sea, but in the name of the people who lived in its shadow. In November of 1811, when the air in San Salvador still carried the scent of wet stone from the last rains, and the markets bustled with the hum of barter and the clatter of mule hooves on cobblestone, the tension that had been building for years between the colonial authorities and the growing class of Criollo leaders finally ignited, not in the form of a grand, coordinated campaign like those unfolding in Mexico or Venezuela, but as a sudden, raw assertion that the people of this province could no longer accept orders from a distant, faltering crown whose own streets in Madrid were under the shadow of French occupation, and that their fate should not be tied forever to a monarchy that had already shown its inability to defend or provide for them. At the heart of this rising stood José Matías Delgado, a parish priest whose sermons had long blended the language of faith with a subtle but unmistakable appeal to civic dignity, and the Aguilar brothers, Manuel, Nicolas, and Vicente, men of education and influence who understood that even a failed rebellion could plant seeds that would one day bear fruit. And so it was that, on the morning of November 5th, the bells of San Salvador's main church rang out in a pattern that was both familiar and charged with new meaning, calling not to mass, but to action, summoning townspeople to gather in defiance of the colonial regime. The demands voiced that day were deceptively simple: the removal of unpopular Spanish officials, greater autonomy for local governance, and an end to the heavy-handed economic measures that drained wealth from the province without returning benefit. Yet beneath these demands was an unspoken but radical premise: that legitimate authority could exist outside of the Spanish crown, that a political order rooted in the will of Salvadorans themselves was possible, and that loyalty to the empire was not an immutable law of nature, but a choice that could be withdrawn. The uprising spread quickly through the surrounding towns, carried by messengers on horseback and by word of mouth in markets and taverns. And for a brief, heady moment, it seemed as though the colonial order might truly be in danger, for the garrisons were small, their commanders uncertain, and the momentum of rebellion can sometimes be enough to topple an unsteady regime. But the revolt lacked both the weapons and the coordinated support needed to withstand a sustained military response. And within weeks, Spanish forces, bolstered by loyalist militias, had reasserted control, arresting leaders, dispersing gatherings, and making clear that the price of sedition could be imprisonment or worse. Delgado himself, shielded in part by his clerical status, avoided immediate execution. But many of those who had stood beside him were punished severely. Their properties seized, their reputations tarnished in official records. And the movement as a whole was dismissed by colonial authorities as an isolated flare of discontent rather than a true revolution. Yet the people who had heard the bells that morning, who had stood in the plaza and shouted for change, carried away with them the memory of that moment when fear was set aside and the possibility of a different future came into focus. In the years that followed, smaller acts of resistance, some open, some hidden, continued to trouble the colonial administration, and though the 1811 uprising had been quelled, its example lingered in the minds of a generation who had seen with their own eyes that defiance was possible, that Spaniards could be challenged, and that the bonds of empire, though heavy, were not unbreakable. And when the broader tide of independence finally swept through Central America a decade later, it would find in El Salvador a people already acquainted with the sound of rebellion, already marked by the memory of a morning when church bells rang not for God alone, but for liberty. In 1821, as the long wars of independence in Mexico finally forced Spain to relinquish its hold over much of the Americas, the provinces of Central America seized their own moment, declaring independence from the Spanish crown in a wave of proclamations that swept from Guatemala City to San Salvador. And for a brief, uncertain period, the air was thick with the language of unity, with the promise that the 5 former provinces, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, might bind themselves together into a single political body strong enough to defend their newfound sovereignty, to coordinate their economies, and to present a united front against the inevitable ambitions of foreign powers who would be quick to exploit a fractured region. Initially, El Salvador resisted the first post-independence arrangement, which saw the provinces annexed to the newly formed Mexican Empire under Agustín de Iturbide for the Salvadoran Criollo elite, wary of exchanging one distant ruler for another, feared that the authoritarian tendencies of the Mexican monarchy would smother the local autonomy they had fought to achieve. Petitions were sent, protests were staged, and for a time, it seemed possible that El Salvador might chart its own separate path. But when the Mexican Empire collapsed in 1823 and the provinces reassembled as the Federal Republic of Central America, El Salvador joined the Union with a cautious hope that this time, power might be shared rather than imposed. The Federal Republic, on paper, was an ambitious experiment, a liberal constitution, modeled partly on the United States, promised civil rights, representative government, and a degree of local autonomy within the Federation. Its leaders spoke of building roads to connect the provinces, of harmonizing trade to lift all economies, of creating schools and institutions that would bind the citizens of 5 states into one Central American identity. But almost from the beginning, the Federation was plagued by the same centrifugal forces that had fractured so many other post-colonial states, for the provinces were bound less by a shared history than by convenience, and their elites often valued their own local dominance over the compromises required for union. In El Salvador, as in the other member states, deep political divisions emerged between the liberals, who favored a strong federal government, the separation of church and state, and economic modernization, and the conservatives, who sought to preserve the traditional privileges of the church, maintain close ties between religion and governance, and protect the power of local oligarchies. These ideological battles were not confined to speeches and pamphlets, but spilled into the streets, into militias, and eventually into open warfare, as coups and counter-coups reshaped governments with dizzying frequency. Economic strains added fuel to the fire. Plans for regional infrastructure faltered as provinces quarreled over costs and priorities. Trade routes were disrupted by conflict, and the indigo market, still central to El Salvador's economy, suffered fluctuations that left farmers and merchants alike vulnerable. In this climate of instability, loyalty to the Federation weakened, and political leaders began to calculate that they might be better served by independence than by continued membership in a union that seemed to promise only endless disputes. By the late 1830s, the dream of a united Central America was collapsing under the weight of its contradictions, and the wars between liberal and conservative factions intensified. drawing in foreign mercenaries and leaving behind a trail of burned towns, disrupted harvests, and disillusioned citizens. In 1841, El Salvador formally declared itself a sovereign nation, stepping away from the wreckage of the Federation and into a future that would prove no less turbulent. For the same internal divisions that had helped to break the Union would continue to haunt its politics for decades to come. Thus, the brief life of the Federal Republic left behind a complicated legacy in El Salvador. It had offered a vision of unity and modern governance that inspired many. But its failure also reinforced a political culture in which mistrust of centralized authority, reliance on local strongmen, and the ever-present pull of factionalism would shape the course of the young nation's history, even as it faced the daunting task of building itself without the shield or the burden of a larger Central American state. In the decades following its 1841 emergence as an independent republic, El Salvador found itself thrust into a political and geographical landscape where survival depended not only on managing its own fragile institutions, but also on navigating the shifting alliances and hostilities of its neighbors. For the collapse of the Federal Republic had not extinguished the rivalries between the former member states. In many ways, it had intensified them, turning every border into a potential fault line and every ideological disagreement into a spark that could ignite war. And so it was that the young nation was repeatedly drawn into conflicts with Honduras and Guatemala, sometimes as the aggressor, sometimes as the target, but always at a cost measured in lives, treasure, and political stability. Internally, the Republic was far from united. Political life revolved around the struggle between liberals, who envisioned a modern state based on free trade, secular governance, and integration into the global economy, and conservatives who clung to the influence of the Catholic Church, the preservation of traditional hierarchies, and the protection of landed oligarchies whose estates were the backbone of agricultural production. These divisions, inherited from the federal era, played out in cycles of coups, provisional governments, and brief constitutional experiments, none of which could fully reconcile the competing visions of what El Salvador ought to be. Economically, the mid-19th century saw the gradual rise of coffee as a cash crop, a transformation that would reshape the country's social and political order. While indigo had long been the primary export, its market had been undermined by the advent of synthetic dyes in Europe, and coffee, thriving in the rich volcanic soil of the highlands, offered a lucrative alternative that promised to integrate El Salvador more deeply into international trade. But this promise came at a steep social cost. For the expansion of coffee cultivation required vast tracts of land, much of which was seized from indigenous communities and small farmers through legal reforms that privatized communal lands, stripping away centuries-old systems of collective ownership and pushing the dispossessed into the role of wage laborers on the very estates that had displaced them. This concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a small elite, families who would come to be known as part of the oligarchy that dominated the nation's politics, created a deeply unequal society in which economic opportunity was limited to the privileged few, while the majority of Salvadorans labored for low wages under conditions that offered little hope of advancement. And yet, from the perspective of the ruling class, the coffee economy was a symbol of progress, a way to bring roads, ports, and railways to the country, to attract foreign investment, and to project an image of modernity to the outside world. On the military front, the Republic's frequent wars with its neighbors, often sparked by disputes over trade, borders, or ideological alignment, served to both weaken and define the nation. For each conflict, whether victorious or disastrous, reinforced a sense of separate identity among Salvadorans, even as it drained resources that might have been used for development. These wars also provided opportunities for ambitious generals to seize political power, blurring the line between civilian governance and military authority in ways that would shape the nation's political culture well into the 20th century. By the late 19th century, El Salvador had established itself as a functioning, if unstable, republic. Its capital, San Salvador, rebuilt and expanded after earthquakes and fires. Its coffee exports fueling a small but influential class of wealthy landowners. Its railways and telegraphs linking it more closely to the currents of global commerce. Yet, beneath this facade of progress lay the unresolved tensions of land dispossession, political exclusion, and rural poverty. Tensions that would continue to simmer until they boiled over in future generations, proving that the nation-building of this period was not a finished structure, but a foundation laid on restless, volcanic ground. As the 20th century opened, El Salvador was already locked into an economic structure that revolved almost entirely around coffee. A monoculture so dominant that it not only dictated the rhythms of planting and harvest, but also shaped the very architecture of power. For the families who owned the largest coffee fincas, the so-called 14 families, though in truth, the number fluctuated, controlled the country's wealth, directed its political institutions, and used their influence to ensure that every law, every policy, and every deployment of state resources ultimately served to protect their estates, their exports, and their privileged position in society. The coffee boom, which had promised modernization, had indeed brought paved roads, new ports, and a trickle of foreign capital. But these benefits were channeled almost exclusively toward the export economy, leaving rural communities, the very places where the coffee was grown, in a state of deep neglect, without adequate schools, healthcare, or infrastructure. Their people bound to seasonal labor that paid just enough to survive between harvests, yet never enough to escape dependence. And because land reform had never been seriously contemplated by the ruling elite, the vast majority of arable land remained concentrated in a few hands, while the majority of Salvadorans lived on tiny plots or none at all, relying on whatever day labor they could find. Politically, the Republic in these years was less a representative democracy than an oligarchic dictatorship in which the president, often a military officer chosen with the blessing of the coffee elite, acted as the executive arm of their collective will, maintaining order through a combination of patronage, censorship, and the strategic use of force. Elections, when held, were managed to ensure outcomes favorable to the ruling class and dissent, whether from organized labor, peasant movements, or opposition parties, was quickly suppressed by the National Guard, an institution that came to embody the coercive power of the state. For rural workers, life on the coffee estates was a cycle of toil and displacement. During harvest season, entire families would migrate to the highlands to pick the ripe cherries, working long hours under the watch of overseers, sleeping in makeshift shelters and earning wages that barely covered food. When the season ended, they were expected to return to their home villages or find other temporary work, often facing hunger in the months between harvests. Their labor treated as an expendable commodity in the service of an export machine that sent wealth flowing outward to the capital, to the oligarchs' urban mansions, and beyond, to foreign markets. The divide between the elite and the rest of the population was not merely economic, but also cultural and political. The coffee families saw themselves as custodians of national progress, educated in European fashions, fluent in foreign languages, and convinced that their paternalistic control was necessary to maintain stability. While the majority of Salvadorans, excluded from political life and denied the means to improve their condition, were left with little reason to see the state as their protector. This gulf bred resentment, and though it often lay dormant, it would erupt periodically in strikes, protests, and uprisings that were met with swift and often brutal repression. By the 1920s, the illusion of permanent stability was beginning to fray. The global coffee market, though profitable, was vulnerable to fluctuations in price, and the post-World War I years brought economic turbulence that exposed the fragility of an economy built on a single crop. At the same time, the spread of new political ideas, socialism, anarchism, and labor rights. Through returning migrant workers, students, and foreign publications, began to challenge the legitimacy of the coffee dictatorship, giving voice to the grievances of peasants and workers who had long been silenced. Thus, on the eve of the Great Depression, El Salvador stood as a paradox, a nation that had achieved a measure of economic integration with the modern world, but had done so by deepening internal inequality, concentrating political power in the hands of a narrow elite, and leaving the vast majority of its citizens with little stake in the prosperity their labor had helped to create. A reality that would soon set the stage for one of the bloodiest episodes in its history. In January of 1932, as the dry season settled over the coffee highlands and the harvest drew to a close, the simmering discontent of El Salvador's rural poor, fueled by decades of land dispossession, low wages, and political exclusion, erupted into an uprising that would, in the space of a few weeks, be transformed from a desperate call for justice into one of the most brutal massacres in Latin American history, remembered simply as La Matanza, the slaughter, a name that captures the scale of the violence, but not the depth of the wound it left upon the national soul. The rebellion was led in part by Farabundo Martí, a Marxist organizer and former guerrilla, who had been deeply influenced by global currents of revolutionary thought and by his experiences with the plight of peasants across Central America. Alongside him were indigenous leaders and members of the Communist Party, who saw in the unrest of the early 1930s, exacerbated by the global collapse of coffee prices during the Great Depression, a chance to challenge the oligarchic order and to reclaim land and dignity for the people who had been pushed to the margins of their own country. The spark came in the western departments of Sonsonate and Ahuachapán, where thousands of indigenous peasants and laborers rose against local authorities, seizing towns, attacking symbols of state power, and for a brief moment forcing the coffee elite to confront the reality that the political and economic system they had constructed was not as stable as they had believed. Yet the uprising was unevenly coordinated, and while it was able to overwhelm some rural garrisons, it could not withstand the concentrated force of the Salvadoran military, commanded by General Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, who had seized the presidency in a coup the previous year and now saw in the rebellion not only a threat to order, but an opportunity to consolidate his rule through an unambiguous display of terror. The government's response was swift, uncompromising, and devastating. Troops and armed loyalists swept into the rebel areas, executing not only those who had taken up arms, but also countless civilians suspected of sympathizing with the uprising, targeting entire indigenous communities whose men, women, and children were shot, bayoneted, or beaten to death. Their bodies left in fields, ditches, and riverbeds as a grim warning to anyone who might consider resistance. Estimates of the dead vary, but most historians place the toll at over 30,000 people, an almost unimaginable figure in a country whose population at the time was just over 1 million. And in some villages, the slaughter was so complete that cultural traditions, languages, and communal memory were nearly erased in a matter of days. In the aftermath, Hernández Martínez justified the massacre as a necessary act to protect the nation from communist subversion, a narrative that the coffee elite and their foreign allies were willing to accept, for it allowed them to preserve their privileges while casting the dead as dangerous radicals rather than impoverished citizens seeking redress. Yet beneath this official version, in the quiet spaces of surviving families and in the whispered stories of the few who escaped, La Matanza became a symbol not only of loss, but of the extremes to which the state would go to maintain its power. The repression did not end with the killings. Indigenous identity itself became a liability, and many survivors abandoned their traditional dress, language, and customs in order to avoid drawing the attention of authorities, leading to a forced assimilation that deepened the cultural loss. Public commemoration of the events was suppressed for decades, and only in the late 20th century did La Matanza begin to be openly discussed in Salvadoran society as part of a broader reckoning with the violence of the past. Thus, La Matanza stands as a grim turning point in El Salvador's history, a moment when the distance between ruler and ruled was measured not in words or laws, but in rivers of blood. When the dream of reform was drowned in the language of order, and when the lessons of fear, imposed through mass killing, would shape the nation's political and social life for generations, ensuring that the next great upheaval would come not in the form of petitions or elections, but in the fire and shadows of civil war. By the closing decades of the 20th century, the deep scars left by La Matanza and the decades of military-backed oligarchic rule had hardened into a political order that excluded the vast majority of Salvadorans from meaningful participation. An exclusion that became even more intolerable as the Cold War reframed every domestic conflict through the lens of a global struggle between capitalism and communism, drawing El Salvador into the gravitational pull of superpowers whose interests had little to do with the well-being of its people and everything to do with preventing or promoting ideological influence in the region. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, successive military governments, backed by the coffee elite and tacitly supported by the United States, promised modernization, economic growth, and stability. But these promises rang hollow in the countryside, where land remained concentrated in a few hands, wages stagnated, and basic services were almost non-existent. As peasant organizations, student groups, and labor unions began to demand reform, they were met not with negotiation, but with surveillance, intimidation, and targeted killings carried out by security forces and shadowy death squads whose operations blurred the line between state policy and private vengeance. By the late 1970s, the repression had escalated to such a degree that armed resistance began to coalesce into a more organized force, as various leftist guerrilla movements, rooted in peasant activism, radicalized university networks, and disillusioned segments of the working class, joined together to form the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN. Named for the leader executed in the wake of the 1932 Uprising. Their stated goal was to overthrow the military dictatorship and create a government that represented the interests of the poor. But in the polarized climate of the Cold War, this aim was quickly interpreted by Washington as a proxy threat from Havana and Moscow, setting the stage for massive U.S. involvement in the conflict. The war officially erupted in 1980, a year marked by some of the most galvanizing and horrifying events in modern Salvadoran history, including the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Arnulfo Romero, a vocal critic of state violence and champion of the poor, gunned down while celebrating Mass in San Salvador, his death sending shockwaves far beyond the country's borders. In that same year, the El Mozote massacre saw U.S.-trained Salvadoran troops slaughter more than 800 civilians, most of them women and children, in a rural village accused of harboring guerrilla sympathizers, an atrocity that would remain one of the most infamous war crimes of the conflict. The conflict quickly became a war of attrition, fought in mountains, jungles, and urban neighborhoods, with the FMLN controlling swathes of rural territory and launching attacks on infrastructure, military outposts, and even parts of the capital, while the government, bolstered by billions in U.S. military aid, relied on airstrikes, counterinsurgency sweeps, and intelligence operations to wear down the insurgents. Caught in the middle was the civilian population, subject to forced recruitment, displacement, and the constant threat of violence from both sides. With entire communities forced to choose between risking reprisal from the army or from the guerrillas, depending on who held control on any given day. Internationally, El Salvador became a symbol of the ideological battles of the era. Washington portrayed its support for the government as a defense of democracy against communist expansion, while the FMLN received political backing and limited material aid from Cuba, Nicaragua's Sandinista government, and sympathizers in Europe. Yet for Salvadorans themselves, the war was less about abstract ideologies than about the immediate, grinding struggle for survival in a country where the economy collapsed under the strain of conflict, where infrastructure was destroyed as quickly as it could be repaired, and where the social fabric frayed under the weight of displacement, loss, and trauma. By the early 1990s, after more than a decade of fighting, some 75,000 people had been killed and many more wounded or disappeared. The war having accomplished little in the way of decisive victory for either side, but having succeeded in exhausting the nation to the point where negotiation became not only possible, but necessary, leading both the government and the FMLN to accept that the battlefield would not deliver what could only be won at the table, and that the future of El Salvador, however uncertain, would have to be forged in the language of peace rather than the logic of war. On January 16, 1992, in the grand historic halls of Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, representatives of the Salvadoran government and the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, FMLN, sat across from one another at a long, polished table, the air thick with the weight of 12 years of civil war, 75,000 dead, and an untold number of wounded, displaced, and disappeared. And though the setting was ceremonial, with foreign dignitaries, UN mediators, and photographers present to witness the moment, the negotiations that had led to this day had been anything but theatrical, forged instead in months of tense, often bitter dialogue, in which each side was forced to concede not only ground, but also the narratives by which they had justified their cause. The Chapultepec peace accords did not appear overnight. They were the culmination of a gradual, grinding realization on both sides that neither the government's US-backed military campaigns nor the FMLN's sustained insurgency could secure an outright victory, and that continuing the war would yield only more loss without altering the stalemate that had settled across the country. This recognition was sharpened by shifting global currents, for with the Cold War's end, the ideological imperatives that had fueled superpower involvement in El Salvador were fading, and the United States, while still concerned with maintaining influence in the region, had grown more inclined to support a negotiated resolution rather than indefinitely financing a conflict that had lost its geopolitical urgency. The accords themselves were comprehensive, addressing not just the cessation of hostilities, but the dismantling and restructuring of the very institutions that had sustained the war. The armed forces, long an instrument of elite and military dominance, were to be reduced in size and stripped of internal security duties, with a new civilian police force, trained under international oversight, taking responsibility for law enforcement. The feared security apparatus, including the notorious National Guard and Treasury Police, was to be disbanded. The FMLN would demobilize its combatants, disarm, and transform into a legal political party, able to compete in elections rather than in firefights. Equally significant, though perhaps more challenging to implement, were provisions aimed at addressing the systemic injustices that had fueled the conflict in the first place. Judicial reforms promised greater independence and impartiality. Human rights were to be enshrined and monitored through both domestic and international mechanisms. And there were commitments, at least on paper, to tackle the inequities of land ownership, offering redistribution and credit to former combatants and displaced peasants in an effort to reintegrate them into civilian life. A truth commission, backed by the United Nations, was established to investigate and document the gravest abuses committed during the war, with the hope that public acknowledgement, if not immediate justice, might help heal the wounds of the nation. When the agreement was signed, there were cheers, applause, and the symbolic embrace of former enemies, images that would be broadcast around the world as evidence that even a war as entrenched and bitter as El Salvador's could end through negotiation. Yet, beneath the celebration, there was also an undercurrent of uncertainty. For the Accords were not a magic spell that could erase decades of violence and mistrust, and their success depended on the willingness and capacity of both state institutions and former rebels to honor commitments that would, in many cases, require them to act against entrenched interests and habits of power. In the months that followed, demobilization camps were set up, weapons were collected and destroyed under UN supervision, and FMLN leaders traded fatigues for civilian clothing as they prepared to enter the political arena. Soldiers accustomed to patrolling villages with rifles were reassigned or discharged, some adapting to civilian life, others drifting toward the growing networks of organized crime that offered a violent continuity in a society still saturated with arms and trauma. The new National Civil Police began its training, symbolizing a break with the repressive past, though it would face enormous challenges in earning public trust. The Chapultepec Peace Accords marked a turning point not simply because they ended the shooting, but because they represented a rare instance in which a deeply polarized society agreed, however reluctantly, to dismantle the machinery of its own oppression and to imagine a shared future. And though the decades since have revealed both the limitations of the agreement and the stubborn persistence of inequality and violence, that day in January 1992 remains etched in Salvadoran memory as the moment when the sound of gunfire finally gave way, however briefly, to the possibility of dialogue. The guns may have fallen silent after January 1992, but the silence that followed in El Salvador was not the peaceful stillness of a society healed. It was instead the uneasy, brittle quiet of a country emerging from the smoke of 12 years of civil war into a landscape where the ruins were not only physical, but also institutional, economic, and psychological, and where the very structures intended to sustain the newly won peace were immediately tested by the weight of realities that the Chapultepec Peace Accords, for all their ambition, could not fully address. In the countryside, where the war had raged the fiercest, thousands of demobilized combatants, both from the army and from the FMLN, returned to communities that were scarcely more prosperous or secure than when they had left, often finding that the promised land redistribution was mired in bureaucracy, underfunded, or obstructed by entrenched landowners who had no intention of surrendering their holdings. The rural economy, already fragile from decades of inequality, now had to absorb not only these former fighters, but also waves of returning refugees from abroad. People who brought with them hope for a new life, yet faced the same scarcity of jobs, credit, and basic services that had helped fuel the war in the first place. In the cities, the challenges took a different but equally destabilizing form. During the war, large numbers of Salvadorans had fled to the United States, and many of their children, born or raised in Los Angeles and other American cities, grew up in neighborhoods plagued by poverty, racism, and gang violence, where survival often meant joining groups like Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, or Barrio 18. When U.S. authorities began large-scale deportations of these young men in the mid-1990s, they returned not to the neighborhoods of their parents' youth, but to a post-war El Salvador unprepared to receive them, bringing with them the gang structures, codes, and rivalries forged in American streets, and transplanting them into a society where the institutions of law and order were still fragile. The result was a surge in organized criminal activity that the new National Civil Police, despite being created as a civilian force meant to replace the repressive security apparatus of the past, was ill-equipped to contain. Corruption, inadequate training, and the sheer scale of the problem meant that the police often relied on heavy-handed tactics reminiscent of the war years, further eroding public trust, while the gangs entrenched themselves in poor neighborhoods, controlling territory, extorting businesses, and recruiting new generations of young men and women for whom the promises of peace had delivered little tangible change. Economically, the country leaned heavily on remittances from Salvadorans abroad, which soon became one of the largest sources of national income, surpassing even coffee exports. While this flow of money kept countless families afloat, it also masked the underlying weakness of an economy that offered too few stable jobs at home. And it deepened the dependence on a diaspora whose ties to the homeland were shaped as much by necessity as by nostalgia. Meanwhile, the adoption of neoliberal economic policies, privatization of state enterprises, trade liberalization, and fiscal austerity was hailed by international lenders as a path to modernization. But for many Salvadorans, it meant higher costs, fewer public services, and a widening gap between the wealthy and the poor. Politically, the post-war era saw the transformation of the FMLN from a guerrilla movement into a legal political party, which, along with the right-wing Arena Party, rooted in the wartime military and business elite, dominated the electoral arena in a polarized two-party system, while the alternation of power between these rivals was presented as evidence of democratic consolidation. The bitterness of their rivalry often paralyzed governance, with each side more invested in discrediting the other than in addressing the structural inequalities that had outlived the war. Thus, the years after 1992 revealed a paradox. El Salvador had ended its civil war without returning to open armed conflict, and yet the violence continued in new forms: gang killings, extortion, and police crackdowns that claimed thousands of lives each year. The peace accords had restructured the machinery of the state, but they had not transformed the underlying conditions of poverty, exclusion, and mistrust, leaving the country in a state of suspended peace, where the absence of war did not necessarily mean the presence of justice. In the early decades of the 21st century, El Salvador stood at a crossroads where the unresolved legacies of its colonial past, the traumas of its civil war, and the corrosive influence of transnational crime converged to produce a society defined as much by resilience as by instability. A nation whose international image was often reduced to headlines about gangs, migration, and political unrest, yet whose people continued to navigate daily life with a stubborn determination to wrest a measure of dignity from circumstances that seemed, year after year, to conspire against them. By the 2000s, the territorial grip of gangs, such as MS-13 and Barrio 18, had become so entrenched that they functioned, in many poor urban neighborhoods and rural towns, as shadow governments, levying their own forms of taxation through extortion, enforcing their own codes of justice through violence, and waging bloody turf wars that claimed thousands of lives annually. Their presence was both a symptom and a cause of deeper social fractures, feeding off the poverty, unemployment, and social dislocation that decades of uneven development had left in their wake, while also driving further cycles of fear, displacement, and economic stagnation. Government responses alternated between hardline crackdowns, mano dura policies that filled prisons to bursting with suspected gang members, often on the basis of little more than appearance or association, and attempts at dialogue or truce that, while temporarily reducing homicide rates, collapsed under political pressure and public distrust, leaving citizens to conclude that no administration had yet found a lasting formula for restoring security without deepening the wounds of repression. Meanwhile, the prison system itself became a crucible for gang organization, with incarcerated leaders directing operations on the outside, turning what was meant to be a containment strategy into an incubator of further violence. In 2019, the election of Nayib Bukele marked a dramatic departure from the post-war political order, breaking the decades-long dominance of the right-wing Arena Party and the leftist FMLN, and signaling a public appetite for leadership that claimed to transcend the entrenched ideological divide. Bukele, a young, media-savvy former mayor, harnessed social media with unprecedented skill, projecting himself as a pragmatic reformer willing to challenge old elites and take bold action where previous governments had failed. And his administration quickly launched aggressive measures to combat gang violence, deploying mass arrests and expanding the prison system while boasting steep declines in homicide rates. Yet these successes, loudly celebrated by his supporters, came with mounting concerns from human rights organizations, journalists, and international observers, who warned that the government's security strategy relied on emergency powers, mass detentions without due process, and the concentration of authority in the executive branch, raising fears that in the quest for safety, the fragile democratic gains of the post-war period might be eroded. Bukele's move to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021, hailed by some as a visionary economic experiment and criticized by others as a risky gamble, further underscored the president's penchant for headline-grabbing initiatives whose long-term impact remained uncertain. At the same time, the deep structural problems of El Salvador persisted. The economy continued to rely heavily on remittances from the diaspora. Poverty and inequality remained stubbornly high, and the pressures of climate change, manifesting in droughts, floods, and the ever-present threat of volcanic and seismic disasters, compounded the vulnerabilities of a country where many communities lived quite literally on unstable ground. Migration flows to the United States, driven by a mix of economic need, violence, and environmental stress, kept entire families separated, while also sustaining a lifeline of income that, paradoxically, made the nation more dependent on those who had left. Thus, modern El Salvador is a place of contradictions, a nation where the government claims unprecedented security gains even as concerns over authoritarianism grow, where technological experiments like Bitcoin coexist with rural economies still tied to subsistence farming, where the faces of a young, restless population are shaped by both the scars of history and the allure of global connectivity, and where the future will be decided not only by the strength of state policies, but by the enduring capacity of its people to survive, adapt, and insist in the shadow of volcanoes on carving out a life that is their own. To speak of El Salvador is to speak of a country that has learned, in a way few others have, to measure time not only in years or generations, but in eruptions, earthquakes, and political tempests. Each one a reminder that permanence is an illusion, and that survival is built not on the absence of disaster, but on the ability to stand again after the ground has shifted beneath your feet. I have walked through villages rebuilt 3 times in a single lifetime, spoken with farmers whose fields have been buried in ash and reborn as fertile soil, and heard from families who keep a packed bag by the door, not because they expect to flee, but because here, readiness is as much a tradition as celebration. There is something in the Salvadoran spirit that outsiders often miss when they look only at statistics of violence or migration. It is in the way a community gathers after a quake to clear rubble before aid arrives, in the way the smell of fresh pupusas drifts from a roadside stand even as smoke still rises from a distant slope, in the way laughter persists in a country where the word risk has never been theoretical. Yes, the story of El Salvador is one of exploitation, inequality, and repression. But it is also the story of defiance, of people who have been told 100 times to yield and have answered 100 times with the stubborn insistence that this is their land, their home, their fight. Perhaps that is why its history feels less like a straight line and more like the breathing of its volcanoes. Periods of quiet that are never truly still, ruptured by bursts of transformation, some destructive, others liberating. And perhaps that is why the question of its future cannot be answered only in policies or promises. It must also be answered in the resilience of its people, in the ways they pass on not just memory, but the skills of survival, in how they continue to imagine a tomorrow that is worth enduring the trials of today. If you have stayed with me through this journey, from the first footprints of the Pipil and Lenca to the steel and fire of conquest, from the blue-gold wealth of indigo to the red stain of La Matanza, from the gunfire of civil war to the uneasy quiet of modern reforms, then you have walked through the beating heart of a nation that has faced the impossible more times than history can count, and has somehow remained standing. This is why I believe El Salvador cannot be understood by its tragedies alone. It must be seen in the small, ordinary acts that defy despair. In the planting of a new coffee row on land scarred by landslides, in the rebuilding of a school after an earthquake, in the quiet way an elder tells a child, "We have survived worse." These are the threads that bind its past to its future. And so, as the story of El Salvador continues to unfold, as the volcanoes sleep and stir, as politics shift and storms gather, remember this: survival here is not an accident. It is a choice made daily, in countless unseen ways. If you want to keep exploring the untold histories of nations, stories shaped by fire, by water, by hope, and by the will to endure, then subscribe to Stories of Countries and join me in uncovering the worlds that live behind the maps.